This is the John Batchelor Show. Larry Kudlow is here, and I want to spend some more time speaking of Larry's column up in the Wall Street Journal right now, because this is a story, a narrative that Larry's presented to me for many years. 10 years, Larry, we've been talking about how Kennedy cut taxes. And we started talking about it when you and I first started working together, and George Bush was in the White House after the Bush tax cut, which was very successful in the first Bush administration. Here we have a budget today from the President of the United States, a prospective budget he's sending over to Congress to look at and to consider, in which the president is proposing to raise taxes more than $1 trillion and raise it specifically on the people who are the well-to-do and are the hirers and job creators. It would look like in 60 years since John Kennedy, in this time, 55 years now, since John Kennedy took the administration, that the Democratic Party has changed sides, Larry, or forgotten its roots? How to explain this?
Well, I think the Democratic Party has changed sides and moved so far to the left. You know, I've had this conversation with Senator Joe Lieberman, who's probably my favorite Democrat, and he calls himself a JFK Democrat. And the reason for that is that Kennedy was a very hardliner, anti-communist, and was for a strong defense, and so is Lieberman. And Kennedy wanted to cut all the tax rates, including the capital gains tax rate, and so did Lieberman. And the other guy in the middle of this is an ex-Democrat who became a Republican, and his name is Ronald Reagan. And Reagan voted for FDR 4 times and voted for Harry Truman once. But Reagan became persuaded later that lowering marginal tax rates was the way to get growth. And so when he inherited stagflation in 1980, he immediately went for the growth solution of lower tax rates. Now, here's the interesting part. Reagan approvingly quoted Kennedy all the time. In fact, the phrase, "a rising tide lifts all boats," originally came from JFK. And Reagan used that phrase. Jack Kemp used that phrase. I've used that phrase so many times. So the Democratic Party on foreign policy and on at least tax policy has moved so far to the left that they've really forgotten the lessons of Kennedy and growth.
We welcome Sudeep Reddy of the Wall Street Journal, financial correspondent, watching the Federal Reserve especially. Sudeep, good evening to you. Larry and I have been discussing his op-ed with his colleague, Brian Domatrovic. Larry, do I say that correctly? Domatrovic, in the Journal tomorrow about the age of Kennedy cutting taxes and observing the irony that the president's budget today includes $1 trillion more new taxes, especially on those who are understood as entrepreneurs. Your measure on the president's budget today, it looks like a campaign document at the same time. Is this independent of the economy, the Great Recession, and the slow recovery? Good evening to you, Sudeep.
Good evening, John. If you look at the president's budget, it's all about safety. He's trying to be very safe, given where his party is right now, given not only the election now, but all of the sensitivity that you're going to have about the 2016 election. And if you consider what the president has accomplished with prior budget documents, you don't have a whole lot to show for it. So all of what Washington has done over the last few years has been through crises and through step-by-step moments. There were plenty of opportunities to use the crises to do something big on the entitlement front. There are a lot of reasons why that didn't happen. You can blame the president, you can blame John Boehner, but it didn't happen. And so there are no more action-forcing events to lead to a big deal, so why fight it?
Yeah, Sudeep, I basically agree with that. The heartbreaker for me is the president's maltreatment of corporate tax reform, which I think is absolutely so important and would be such a big contributor to economic growth. Now he says he wants to lower the rate from 35 to 28, but he spends most of his time in this budget and elsewhere talking about what they call transitory tax increases and going after companies that have money offshore. And he's got, in sum, a $500 trillion tax hike on business. And to me, that is just an absolute, it's going to be a killer. I mean, it's not going to go through, but if it did, it would be a killer. But it absolutely destroys any chance of bipartisanship or comedy on the whole idea of tax reform, which should be revenue neutral. I mean, you want to lower the rates, and you want to get rid of the deductions and the special cronyism and the rest of it. And this just doesn't go there. And I think that's so too bad, because Dave Camp put out his ideas, and they're not perfect. But there's an awful lot of people in Washington who want corporate tax reform, even in the Democratic Party. I don't think Obama helped that cause at all.
Obama has expressed his willingness to do corporate tax reform, but it requires a lot of pieces to line up. The budget that came out today, it was all about dealing with what he would call corporate loopholes, kind of plugging the tax code a little bit. And in theory, when you plug the loopholes, that is what you would use to lower the rate. That is where you get the economic effect. Parts of the budget seem to suggest let's plug the loopholes, plug the holes in the tax code, and use the money elsewhere on infrastructure, on other programs. That's not quite what most people should be getting at when they talk about corporate tax reform, because the only way you lower the rate is by dealing with some of the eccentricities of the tax code, if you will. But there's another deeper problem here, that the moment anyone in this town talks about corporate tax reform, it is the biggest stimulus package for the tax lobbyists. They will step up. They will try to defend their particular provisions in the tax code. And on top of that, you then have the groups that represent small businesses stepping up and saying, well, what about us? What about the individual tax code, the individual tax rates, because small businesses are then subject to the individual tax rates. Why aren't you helping us? How can you do corporate tax rates and not do individual tax rates that are affecting small businesses? And that immediately resonates with lawmakers who care a lot more about small business.
Sudeep Reddy of the Wall Street Journal. Beg pardon, we're so short tonight with you, Sudeep. Thank you for helping us. Larry Kudlow of Kudlow Reports. I'm John Batchelor.